Well, thank you very much. I have to start by saying that when I talk about the issues from any country, I want to insist that we should be thankful. In other words, I often hear Green spokesmen who never say thank you for anything that is done, but immediately launch into what needs to be done. Well, now, I think there's a hell of a lot that needs to be done, but unless you say thank you to the things that are being done, you don't get on to the next stage, and I think this is increasingly important. The United Kingdom government has been very ambitious in the sense that it has set the toughest targets of any country in the world. A reduction in its emissions on 1990 by 68% by 2030 and by 78% by 2035. It's said that there will be no more sale of motor cars except electric or equivalent after 2030, and it has committed itself to stop generation by fossil fuels in 2035. Now, all this comes because of our particular system of the Climate Change Act and the Climate Change Committee, because we set up a cross-party operation in an act introduced by the Labour government but prepared by the Conservative and Liberal Democrats and all the other opposition parties. So it is genuinely a cross-party concept. And that means that the Climate Change Committee has a great deal of independence. There are 8 of us. All the rest, except for me, are world-renowned scientists or economists. I'm the one who tries to make sure that what they say is comprehensible by ordinary people. As you know, there is a problem of connection between science and the technology and the way we talk, and trying to explain these things to people who don't see this as their central interest in life. And the chairman is appointed independently by the 4 governments of the United Kingdom. That means that you usually get 4 different political parties, so you find it quite easy to ensure that the person who is there is clearly independent. And then we have every 5 years to do a 5-year budget well in advance. Much easier to get parliamentarians to vote for a budget which is in 10 years' time than a budget that's happening next year. So we now just had the 6th carbon budget, which takes us to 2038. Each of these budgets are put before Parliament. Parliament has in fact agreed to all of them, and that then becomes law and legally binding. The government must meet that budget, and if it doesn't, it can be taken to court. I wouldn't take it to court, but somebody else would, Friends of the Earth or somebody of that sort. And as I say to ministers, I would be the first witness for the prosecution. So would they please not put me in that position? So the situation is that we are in a very strong position in terms of what the government has promised, and nobody disagrees that that is a remarkable thing. It does no harm for it coming from the right, because there's nowhere else for the sort of people who might otherwise find an excuse for not supporting it to go. So that does work out extremely well. But the problem of that is that you then have to make sure that people actually do what it is that they say they're going to do. Now, so far, they have. But it's getting more and more difficult. And so we have been pressing the government to produce its programme. And so 2 weeks ago came the first 2 major bits of that, which is, first of which was the government's net zero strategy, which sets in law the things that need to be done, and also its heat and buildings strategy, because that is perhaps our most difficult area. Now, that means we've done step 2. we've got step one, which you have to have. I get a bit cross when people say, you know, it's only an aim. It's only, actually, you don't get anywhere unless you decide where you want to go. A generality of direction is no use whatsoever. But once you've fixed that, then you have to have a programme, and the government has set in that a programme of which we are, in the Climate Change Committee, independently able to say that we're very pleased with it, because in general it has enshrined in the government's policy what we have asked for. But there are gaps in it, and one of the great pleasures of Globe is that we can discuss our own gaps and see how one overcomes them. Now, the two major gaps that we think there are is, first of all, a proper land use policy. We don't really see how we are going to deal with net zero by 2050, to which we are legally required to assent and to reach, unless we do something much more effective about how we use the land, to make the land more fertile, to take in more of the carbon which it used to take in, and thereby increasing the fertility so that we deal with that. Regenerative farming is a crucial part of whatever we are able to do. And we also have to plant a lot of trees. Well, we are committed to planting the trees, but we need to have a proper programme. And we also need to have a detailed programme for farmers to know what they are to do. The government has committed itself after leaving the European Union, which was, of course, a very, very wrong thing to have done, and we shouldn't have done it, and it will do us a great deal of damage. Don't want to make anybody unaware of the fact that that is the view, not only of me, but most people who are trying to deal with the issues of climate change, because we have to do them jointly and together. But they've done it. And they therefore have decided that they will change our agricultural policy from the production-based policy, which we've had both in the European Union and before we joined it, to one which is supposed to pay for public good. In principle, I'm very much in favour of that. That sounds really very good. The trouble is, nobody knows how it's going to work. And farmers are left with the end of the previous system, and they don't know what the next one is. And it's just something that I really do think we have to say to governments. We are in a very difficult situation because the public don't understand what are the actual details of how you move. And we've got to be much better at what would be rudely called public relations, but what I really think is public information. How do you, and that means telling people well in advance when things will be changed. We've got to be better at that, and none of us are yet good enough. And the second great gap which we have is a gap which I think very many countries have. It is this fear that governments have of talking about behavioural change. And yet much of the change that we need is really rather good. I mean, I hope most people think that the use of video is very cheerful, because it means you don't have to travel all over the place for no particularly good reason. 3 out of 4 of our air flights, in my view, are really unnecessary if you can talk to somebody as easily as you can from your own drawing room. And what's more, going into the office more than 3 days a week seems to me to be an unlikely experience for many people in the future. All these things are behavioural change, and we should be encouraging them and helping them. And then there's the question of, and I really end on this because it's very controversial, we really ought to eat less anyway, altogether, but we certainly ought to eat less meat. And all that we have said in the Climate Change Committee is that we should reduce our meat eating by between 20 and 30% between now and 2050. Now, anybody who knows what's happening knows that people are doing that anyway. And what's more, that plant-based food is actually edible now, whereas it was really horrific before. But no, it is very good. And even I, a well-known carnivore, finds it very pleasant to have that mix, and I try very much to do what I have said we ought to do. But if you ask the health people, of course, they want you to move much further than that. So actually doing this is a good thing for us to do. And I see the Parliament of Argentina in front of me. One of the things, I love Argentina, but I must say I long for a lettuce in Argentina, because the mixture of food is just actually not very sensible, and we have all of us to learn from each other. And so what I am saying is that we've really got to have a way of looking at the future which understands that beating climate change is absolutely essential, but doing it is going to make a greener, cleaner, kinder world. In other words, we must take people and lift them beyond just the battle against climate change and show that doing those things that we need to do does in fact create a society which will be a better one than the one we live in today.